Israel's alliance with the European Union is under mounting pressure. Behind the shift, demands to suspend the main agreement underpinning their close relations. But their ties survived Israel's war on Gaza, so why the difficulties now? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Israel's alliance with the European Union is among its most important, but it's coming under pressure not seen before from some of its staunchest allies as the Iran war causes huge political difficulties. Brussels has condemned Israel's invasion of Lebanon. The German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank are de facto annexation. The Italian leader, Giorgia Meloni, has scrapped a defence cooperation pact with Israel, and a petition with more than 1 million signatures will formally trigger a review of the EU-Israel Association Agreement, a vital trade framework. Their alliance withstood Israel's war on Gaza, which killed more than 72,000 Palestinians, but it seems to be on rockier ground now. So why is this happening? Is it a long-term shift in relations? We'll discuss all of this with our panel of guests, but first this report from Imran Ullah Khan.
In Beijing on Tuesday, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez paid particular attention to Israel in front of his host Chinese leader Xi Jinping.
What we want is for international legality to be respected, for example, in the Middle East. Today, international legality is fundamentally being violated by one country, which is the government of Israel. There is also an absolutely illegal response from the Iranian regime regarding a war that we have classified from the very beginning as a mistake. Today, international legality is being trampled on, and not only that, but those of us who raise our voices against those governments that are violating international law find ourselves contradictorily and paradoxically subjected to threats from those countries.
In response to what Sanchez called the genocide in Gaza, his government approved an embargo on selling arms to Israel in October. Since then, Israel's attacks have expanded beyond occupied Palestine to Iran and Lebanon. The war has caused major global energy supply disruptions, and now more EU countries are taking action. Italy has suspended a defense cooperation agreement with Israel after accusing Israeli forces of firing at a convoy of Italian UN peacekeepers in Lebanon.
Our alignment is European and Western. I adhere to that position, which I also fully share. Then, when there are things we do not agree with, we act accordingly. The government, for example, taking into account the current situation we are experiencing, has decided to suspend the automatic renewal of the defense agreement with Israel.
The European Union and Israel have extensive trade relations under the EU-Israel Association Agreement. That agreement took effect in 2000 and structures political dialogue and economic cooperation. Currently, the EU is Israel's largest trading partner, with total trade in goods and services reaching about $50 billion. EU imports about $18.7 billion in goods from Israel. That includes machinery and chemicals. A civil petition calling for the full suspension of the EU-Israel Association Agreement has currently reached more than 1 million signatures. It accuses Israel of war crimes. That has triggered the European Parliament to hold a hearing on the campaign. Israel has also recently lost one of its staunchest supporters in Europe, after Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban lost elections on Sunday. Under Orban, Budapest had frequently used its veto power in Brussels to block criticism of Israel. Orban even took action to withdraw from the International Criminal Court after it issued an arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But Europe is Israel's primary market for defense exports, which could lead it to seek middle ground with some of its oldest allies. Imran Ullah Khan, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss all this further with our guests who are joining us today on Inside Story. And from Brussels, we have Barry Andrews, a member of the EU Parliament. From Cape Town in South Africa, Sven Kuhn von Burgsdorff, former EU ambassador to the occupied Palestinian territories. And also in Brussels, Yves Geddie, Director of the European Institutions Office at Amnesty International. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. Let me start with you, Barry. Why does Israel care, or why should Israel care what the EU thinks?
Well, thanks for having me on your program. I have to say that we must remind ourselves that the European Union is Israel's #1 trading partner. And so it is very relevant for Israelis. And of course, there's a very close security and defense partnership between the EU and Israel, whatever you want to say about that. So the links are very, very strong. And there's, of course, very strong historical, social and cultural links between the European Union and Israel. And so from time to time, when, as I see it, the European Union takes a more principled position on the relationship and takes more seriously the terms that have been set out in legal agreements around that relationship, Israel really takes that seriously. But unfortunately, Europe taking those principled positions has been all too rare and not really robust enough to create the changes that are absolutely necessary if we're serious about EU values, if we're serious about the protection of international law, and if we're serious about Palestinians' right to self-determination. So I think it is a very, very important relationship, but unfortunately, we haven't seen that principled approach often enough.
So, Yves, the EU has real leverage, both economically and diplomatically, if it decides to use it.
Indeed, as Israel's biggest trading partner and as also a partner which has its basis for its foreign policy based on a clear human rights obligation, the EU has massive leverage on Israel, which it can and which we believe it finally must use to help have a permanent end to the Gaza, Israel's genocide on Palestinians in Gaza, and also its violations against Palestinians in the whole occupied territory, and also the recent violations we've seen against Lebanon and other infringements of international law. I think we've seen the recent death penalty law, which Israel has applied, which will de facto only apply exclusively to Palestinians, has been a clear red line for EU member states in recent time. So we think this is the moment which this preferential agreement, this access to the EU market, which also investment and support on education, this has to come to an end. It has to come to an end, not just because of the EU's human rights obligations, because of the text of the agreement itself, which requires that these relations and cooperation are based on human rights.
Sven, I mean, what would you say is the main issue here with regard to Israel, which seems to now be waging a continual war? It doesn't ever seem to stop fighting on numerous fronts. And of course, we have what many describe as the Greater Israel Project.
Yes, thanks, James, for having me. The basic problem is that Mr. Netanyahu and his right-wing annexationist government doesn't care about international law and doesn't care about the EU. Actually, they think they can do what they want to pursue their political objectives. And Mr. Netanyahu's objectives are first and foremost to stay in power. And for that, he actually is coinciding his policies with his annexationist right-wing partners who dream of a greater Israel. Daniel Levy has recently published a very interesting article in The Guardian on this one. And if you follow this line of reasoning, it's actually Netanyahu playing Trump and any US president over the past 20 years by trying to realize that vision of an Israel which is indispensable for the Middle East as the sole dominant power, fully supported by the US. The problem we have in Europe is that our DNA is very much premised on a firm anchoring to human rights and international law. And if one of our partners completely disregard this, then we are at a loss if we don't act with robust measures. And that's the key issue right now. And that's the reason why in our statement, which you just issued, 350 former ambassadors, ministers, and commissioners, that we call the EU to act to act by suspending the agreement with Israel, by halting all trade in military goods, and by stopping Israel's participation in all EU programs. I can elaborate on that in more detail if need be.
We'll ask you to do that a little later. Barry, I know you've been to Israel-Palestine recently. Would you agree with Sven's comments there that Israel does not actually follow any international law? It doesn't think it has to, and that the EU hasn't really pulled it up on it, on not following international law?
I don't believe Israel takes seriously international law, and in fact, I think President von der Leyen herself even indicated that Europe shouldn't be the custodian of an international law that nobody else is protecting, which is really, really worrying development. One thing I would take issue with is whether Israel takes Europe seriously. I think Israel does take Europe seriously, but only when Europe takes a principled position. And this is unfortunately extremely rare. But we see from the occasions when Europe does take a principled position that it has an effect. So, for example, when the 17 member states in the Foreign Affairs Council concluded that Article 2 of the association agreement between EU and Israel had in fact been breached, that had a very sobering effect on Israel. When President von der Leyen, in her State of the Union speech last September, said that what was happening in Gaza was a man-made famine, I really believe that the Israeli government sat up straight and took notice of this. And when the German government placed restrictions on the export of military equipment, we had two conservative German politicians explicitly condemning Israel for human rights abuses. That has an effect. And soon after, there was a ceasefire. Now, we can attribute that ceasefire to any number of things, but it's my firm belief that when President von der Leyen and Chancellor Merz took strong positions on these issues, it had an impact in Israel. And so that's why we don't give up. And that's why we are heartened by the fact that the Italian government has suspended its defense cooperation agreement. It's why we're heartened by the 350 ambassadors and ministers just referred to just now have submitted this letter, and the 1 million signatures that have been achieved for an EU petition, which will force President von der Leyen to respond to concerns of EU citizens about the protection of international law. So I do believe Europe has a very critical role to play, and I do believe that Israel pays attention.
Yves, let's go into more depth about the various tools that the EU could use here. I mean, it could impose sanctions on individuals. It could impose travel bans. And as we've heard, there's this EU-Israel association agreement, part of which is a trade agreement, but it's widened that. Isn't the problem with the whole system, some would say it's the benefit of the whole system, but it's 27 countries, and for most of these things, they have to act in a unanimous manner. So it's very hard to actually take any action.
Well, indeed, I mean, a lot of the EU's strength has been its, coming together of 27 states. There are certain parts of the agreement which can only be suspended with the unanimity, with 27 states agreeing. But there's other parts which only require what is called a qualified majority vote. And that's a certain portion, a majority of EU member states representing a majority of EU citizens.
Sorry to stop you there, Yves. It gets very confusing, and our viewers won't be following all of them, the qualified majority voting. It's a complex formula. Very quickly explain that for us, if you could.
I will. So what we need in order to suspend the trade element of the association agreement, we just need a majority of member states representing a majority of EU citizens to come out in favour. We have a Foreign Affairs Council happening on the 21st of April, another on the 11th of May. And for us, these will be key for a decision to be made.
So, Sven, that sounds simple, but there have been countries in the European Union who have been asking for that since the early part of the Gaza war, have there not?
Yes, indeed. And I mean, Spain, Slovenia, Ireland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, increasingly as well. have recalled to the Commission and the High Representative that we need to act as an EU, as a collective force. And let me just say to Eva, she rightly said that when it comes to trade measures or development cooperation and research funding measures, we can decide by qualified majority. We don't need all 27. But when it comes to foreign policy and security sanctions, for instance, extending visa bans or applying restrictive measures to individuals like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, these extremist ministers, then we need indeed all 27. And so far, Hungary under Orban has prevented us from acting. And Italy and Germany, plus a couple of other countries, including Slovakia and Austria, and also Hungary, have prevented us from acting with qualified majority. My hope is that the appetite for sanctions is growing. People are aware that the European populace at large is very much against the policy of ignoring the abhorrent human rights violations and international law violations by Israel, and want the EU to act. And that's the reason why, like Barry said, today we're celebrating the 1 million threshold signature. And there was a meeting in the European Parliament today on that matter. So there is a coinciding movement from the populace of Europe at large and more member states. And the latest was Mrs. Meloni yesterday to say enough is enough. We have to act against Israel. The question is the Commission, is Madame Callas taking the initiative to bring it to the discussion? Yeah. And as you know, we had this discussion in July and September last year when Madame Callas presented a 10-point paper with sanctions. It wasn't even brought to a vote because of the belief that it wouldn't pass. Madame von der Leyen, in her State of the Union address in September 25, mentioned a number of issues, and except for suspending few payments to Israel, she didn't move at all and didn't bring it to the discussion with the member states. My question is, are we now ready to move forward? And is the Commission ready as well to take its own measures? We haven't mentioned this yet, James. The EU could actually suspend in its own right, as the executive body being responsible for payment, could actually suspend all payments to Israeli public and private entities benefiting from EU research programs without going for a council decision. We have done that with Russia. We can do it with Israel.
Barry, I mean, mention there of Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Commission, and Kaja Kallas, who is the high representative, effectively Europe's foreign minister. She was speaking just recently in the UN Security Council about breaches of international law. She said the situation in Ukraine and the Middle East were examples. And then she named Russia and she named Iran. Somehow there was a little bit of an omission. She did not name and shame the US or Israel. This is the problem, isn't it?
It certainly is. And it's what completely undermines the credibility of Europe's voice on the world stage, where from time to time we call in evidence of the undermining of international law events in Russia and Ukraine, which is absolutely correct, and has the support of the vast majority of people and politicians here in the EU, but then failing to extrapolate from that exactly the same thing and worse is happening to the people of Gaza, to the illegal settlements that are happening in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, and now happening in South Lebanon. And, you know, people aren't stupid. Other members of the United Nations are very aware of these double standards, whereas on the one hand, we're very happy to support the International Criminal Court, which issues an arrest warrant against Netanyahu. But when it issues an arrest warrant against Putin, there's a cheerleaders across Brussels about that. And it's just not credible. And I'm afraid that High Representative Vice President Callas, by failing to do these omissions, is consistently degrading the credibility of the European Union across the world. So I fully agree that we need to get to a point where we understand that Article 2 of the Association Agreement commits both sides to the protection of human rights and democratic principles, and that it is clear that the European Union, the vast majority of Europeans, have concluded a long time ago that Israel has very, very profoundly and fundamentally breached that commitment. And so we have to move to, if not a suspension immediately, at least a review of that agreement in order to bring an end and to exercise the leverage. I mean, a true friend of Israel will say that the best thing we can do is point you in the correct direction of acknowledging the right of Palestinians to self-determination, redirecting Israel policy towards a two-state solution, and at the very least, providing for humanitarian access in the areas that it's currently occupying, including in South Lebanon.
Eve, would you say that EU political leaders have been out of step with public opinion? Because when you look at the public, and particularly the young people in the European Union, they believe there was a genocide in Gaza. And that's not a word their leaders will use.
For sure, James. I mean, we talk to people across, the full breadth of Europe, of all ages, from all backgrounds, who support human rights, many of whom their view of the European Union has declined significantly because of the European Union's stance and failure to act on the genocide in Gaza, on Israel's illegal occupation across the West Bank as well. I mean, a country like my own in Ireland had one of the highest public opinion, highest views of the EU across the Union, and that's declined quite dramatically. And the main reason given for that in polling was that people just saw Ursula von der Leyen, other European leaders not stepping up and not acting how they feel they should on EU values when it came to the situation in Israel. So for over a year, we as Amnesty and supporters, not only across Europe, but around the globe, have been calling on the EU to stop greenlighting Israel's crimes and suspend this agreement. As was mentioned, this petition online reaching 1 million signatures, and today crawling towards 1.5 million signatures of European citizens who are calling for their leaders to do better. So European leaders are certainly out of step. We think the new generation is growing up with a very different view, and I would say a very negative view of the European Union, which doesn't really align with their views of the world, of the human rights or values which they want this union to be promoting, particularly in today's world.
Sven, I don't want to belittle the smaller members of the European Union, particularly as I have two Irish nationals on the panel with me, but how important is it that we're seeing things change in countries like Italy and countries like France and Germany, which are taking a much tougher line against Israel, the big beasts, as it were?
I mean, I'm a German national, and of course, I was groomed as a baby boomer with a very pro-Israeli and pro-Jewish attitude, and rightly so, because of the terrible crimes Germans committed against the Jews for centuries, as a matter of fact, and particularly during the Holocaust. So there is a bit of what we call Erinnerungskultur or Staatsräson, which makes it so difficult for German political leaders to be critical towards Israel. But that is a complete mistaken interpretation of obligations under the Genocide Convention. And other countries like Austria, which were part of that sort of cultural inhibition to criticize Israel, and Italy in a way as well. I mean, basically, countries which during the Second World War had fascist governments and persecuted Jews. Now, the problem is we have to actually realize that we only honor the commitment we have of a never again if we actually take the Genocide Convention by its very wording and definition. We can never allow that crimes against humanity, crimes against other people because of their ethnic affiliations, their religious beliefs, or who they are, can never be justified, whether they are Jews or Muslims or Hindus or Christians. And that's the reason why I think it is difficult for Germany and other countries to come to grips with that new development, that Israel is actually committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, we haven't mentioned international law yet sufficiently well. There are two key ICJ rulings which oblige us to act. It's not a matter of convenience or whether we want it. The first was the advisory opinion in July 24, which clearly said the occupation of Israel in Palestine is illegal, is unlawful, and represents the character of either apartheid or segregation. The word apartheid has been mentioned in this ruling for the first time by an international court. And the provisionary measures, which are binding and decided in January and March and in May 24 to stop, prevent, and punish genocide, also are binding on all UN and EU member states, meaning we have to take obligations with a view to ensuring that genocide in Gaza and elsewhere cannot happen. And we haven't taken a single measure, except for the German government for a couple of months last year, stopping or halting military goods to Israel, which can be used in the war in Gaza. But they have lifted that again.
Okay, important legal points there, Sven. Barry, I'd like to bring in a little bit more of the politics, though. Do you think that EU countries, one of the reasons they're being a bit bolder is because they're not so afraid of Donald Trump after tariffs, after Greenland? Do you think there is more space now to criticise Israel because they're not worried about the repercussions from the US that they might have been worried about during Biden and during the beginning of the Trump term?
Yeah, I think that definitely constituted a break on the European forthrightness, if I can use that word, on Israel. The obvious main priority for European leaders is Ukraine. And there was a fear that by taking a more robust position on Israel, it might undermine US support for Europe's position on Ukraine and Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression. That hasn't gone away. Let's be clear about that. I think what is additional now is Israel's conduct in Lebanon, which is all the same characteristics of what it did in Gaza, which includes a blockade of humanitarian aid, which I saw for myself when I visited Beirut just a few weeks ago. It includes ethnic cleansing. People are leaving South Lebanon, taking photographs of their houses, their fields, and their villages, assuming they may not be back again. And there are so many examples of the targeting of civilian infrastructure that we see in our news every day. And I think that it's just been an upswell of public opinion so that leaders cannot now avoid the conclusion that what's happening in Lebanon is a repeat of what's happening in Gaza. So it went off the boil after October 2025. Really, there was very little coverage and attention to it, up to and including the American attack on Iran. But I think since the South Lebanon events have become much clearer and much better reported, by the way, than Gaza, where it was almost impossible for international journalists to access. Now international journalists are on the ground. And indeed, UNIFIL, that is a United Nations peacekeeping mission, are present in South Lebanon and the areas occupied by Israel. So there's a huge amount of information coming out. And I think that's having a very, very clear effect on public opinion.
Barry, there was certainly plenty of reporting on Gaza here on Al Jazeera. Eve, finally, do you think this can be a moment for change, the sort of change that human rights organisations like your own have been calling for?
I think it quite simply has to be. We've seen a swell of, growing support. I think we remember at the beginning of the genocide, millions of people pouring onto streets across Europe. I think there was maybe a political sense that outrage and the demands had dried up. But when we see initiatives like the European petition calling for the suspension of the agreement, we see that anger is still there. And the recent death penalty law passed by Israel, the incursions on southern Lebanon, ongoing attacks, flagrant violations, all of which are fueled by impunity, as the international community has stood by and as the European Union has continued to see Israel as a close trade cooperative partner.
OK, thank you very much. Our guests today, Eve Geddie, Sven Kuhn von Burgsdorff and Barry Andrews. If you missed any of this discussion, you can see it and all of our programmes again anytime you want at our website, aljazeera.com. Your thoughts and comments are welcome. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or on X. Tag us when you make your point. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and the team here. Stay tuned. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in just a moment.